It's strange how the city that never sleeps can feel so empty. New Year's Eve in New York City is a raucous symphony of cheering crowds, honking horns, and the occasional drunken serenade. But up here, 20 floors above the chaos, it's just me. The office is quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I should have been with friends, or at least sipping champagne at home while watching the ball drop on TV. Instead, I was here, poring over spreadsheets and ledgers to close the books for the year. Being the manager of a mid-sized finance company meant that when deadlines loomed, my social life took a back seat. Everyone else had left by 5 p.m., eager to escape before the city descended into its annual madness. Even the cleaning staff had clocked out early, leaving the office eerily sterile and devoid of life. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I liked the quiet. But the quiet has a way of shifting, morphing into something heavier when you're alone. By the time the clock hit 10 p.m., I was neck-deep in reconciling accounts. The glow of the computer screen painted the room in cold light. The windows framed the distant glitter of the city, but up here, I may as well have been on the moon. I heard it then, a noise faint but unmistakable, a muffled thump. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My first thought was the HVAC system. It had been acting up lately, coughing and groaning like an old man. But this sound was different, deliberate. A rhythmic scuff, like footsteps, faint but steady. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd left a window cracked somewhere and the wind had nudged a door. Or maybe the building itself was just settling. Then I heard it again. Closer. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The floor was supposed to be empty. I hadn't seen anyone else in the lobby when I came in, and the elevator required a key card for after-hours access. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of cubicles and the break room door, slightly ajar. The air felt different out here, colder, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. No response. I inched toward the break room, each step a battle against the knot of fear tightening in my chest. As I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, the hinges whining in protest. The room was empty, save for the faint smell of burnt coffee. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. The window by the sink was open, wide open. The January air seeping through it felt like ice against my skin. Someone was here. A sound from the far end of the hallway made me spin around, my flashlight catching the edge of movement. Just a flicker, like the tail of a shadow disappearing around a corner. "Hey, who's there?" I cursed myself for the panic in my voice. I sounded more like prey than someone in charge. Footsteps echoed in the darkness now, quick and purposeful. I followed them, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I reached the corner, I stopped, pressing my back against the wall. Slowly, I peeked around, and there he was. A man dressed in dark clothing stood by the office supply closet. His back was to me, but I could see the bulging bag slung over his shoulder and the glint of metal at his waist. A gun. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to back away, to run. But my phone vibrated in my hand. A notification, or maybe an accidental brush of my thumb, and the faint sound shattered the silence. The man spun around. His face was sharp and unshaven, his eyes narrow and gleaming with something between anger and desperation. He didn't say a word. He just raised the gun and pointed it at me. "Turn around," he growled. Hands where I can see them. I did as he said, my thoughts racing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like me. Wallet. Now. I fumbled to pull my wallet from my pocket, my fingers trembling. I tossed it to the floor. He motioned with the gun. The phone, too. I hesitated. If I gave him my phone, I couldn't call for help. But the weight of the gun in his hand was a persuasive argument. Reluctantly, I dropped the phone beside the wallet. Good, he muttered. He backed away slowly, his bag jangling with what sounded like electronics, probably laptops or other devices from the office. My mind raced. He must have broken in through the window. But how did he bypass the building's security? As he neared the stairwell, he paused. Don't move. Don't call anyone. You do, and I'll know. With that, he disappeared into the stairwell, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body rooted to the spot. Eventually, I found the courage to move. I locked the office door behind me and called the police from a desk phone. By the time the officers arrived, the man was long gone. They took my statement, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. Had I seen his face clearly? Did he say anything that might indicate who he was? What had he stolen? I spent the next few days replaying the incident in my mind, dissecting every detail. Something about the man had felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. Then, a week later, the pieces fell into place. The police found the stolen items listed for sale online, traced to an account registered under a name I recognized, Ethan Harper. He was one of our newest hires, a quiet guy who kept to himself. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd been in the office that afternoon, chatting with a coworker about plans for the new year. I'd even wished him a happy holiday as he left. The police arrested him at his apartment. He confessed quickly, explaining that he'd overheard me talking about staying late to close the books. He'd planned everything, breaking in through the fire escape, knowing the security cameras were down for maintenance. I tried not to think about what might have happened if I'd made a wrong move that night. The office felt different after that, like it had absorbed the tension and fear of that night. I couldn't look at the break room window without remembering the cold wind on my face. New Year's Eve would never feel the same. When someone knocks on your door in the middle of a blizzard, you answer. That was the rule my mother always followed, but one New Year's Eve, that rule almost destroyed us. Growing up in rural Minnesota had its perks. The vast grove behind our house, barns to explore, and tractors to climb. My siblings and I made endless memories there. But living 3 miles outside a tiny town with fewer than 1,000 people could feel lonely. During storms, that loneliness turned into isolation. That winter was one of the harshest I remember. Temperatures plummeted below -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow piled high enough to bury cars. When the blizzard hit on New Year's Eve, my dad, a state trooper, was called out to work. We knew he wouldn't be home until the storm passed, and my mom prepared for a long night with just the 3 of us kids. She brought sleeping bags into the living room, popped in a movie, and tried to make the night festive despite the raging storm outside. We were settling in when the knock came. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent, loud, and insistent. My mom froze. We kids peered into the kitchen, watching as she stood by the door, her hand hovering over the lock. She'd always been cautious, especially when Dad wasn't home. But in a blizzard, anyone outside could be in danger. She turned the lock and opened the door a crack. A man stood there, tall and broad, his face partially obscured by a fur-lined hood. Snow clung to his coat, and his boots were caked in ice. His voice carried over the howling wind. "Please, ma'am, my car's stuck. Can I come in?" My mom hesitated, but the cold was unforgiving. She stepped aside, letting him in. The man stomped the snow off his boots and shed his heavy coat, revealing a rough, weathered face and dark eyes that seemed too calm for someone caught in a storm. "Thank you," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "It's brutal out there." My mom nodded but didn't smile. "You're lucky to have found a house out here," she said. "Where's your car?" He waved a hand vaguely backward. "Didn't think I'd make it." Something about him unsettled me. He was too calm, too comfortable, as if he belonged here. But my mom, always polite, gestured toward the fireplace to warm up. My brother, sister, and I stayed on the couch, watching him cautiously. "What are your kids' names?" he asked, turning his attention to us. Mom's smile was tight. "They're just excited for New Year's. We're having a movie night. What about you? What's your name, sweetheart?" "Alina," I said before my mom could answer for me. His smile widened and my stomach twisted. "Alina," he repeated softly, as if testing the name. "That's a beautiful name." The unease in the room grew thicker. My mom noticed it too. She stood abruptly. "I'll make some tea, you must be cold." As she busied herself in the kitchen, the man kept talking to us. He asked about our favorite games, whether we liked the snow, and if we'd ever been sledding at night. My brother answered politely, but my sister stayed silent, her eyes darting nervously to Mom. I tried to focus on the movie, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You know," he said suddenly, "I've got kids too. A little girl about Alina's age." "That's nice," my mom called from the kitchen, her voice strained. The man leaned back in his chair, studying me. "I bet you'd get along with her. She's sweet like you. Loves the snow. I'll bet you'd like where I live. It's out in the country. Lots of space to play." "I like it here," I said firmly. His grin faltered for a moment before returning, wider than before. "Of course you do, princess." My mom returned with the tea, handing him a steaming cup. "The storm should ease up by morning," she said, her tone firmer now. "You're welcome to stay on the couch until then." "That's mighty kind of you," he said, sipping the tea. "But I was hoping to hit the road sooner. Wouldn't want to impose." "You'd freeze out there," she replied. "You should rest." The man nodded, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're right. Best to stay put." We kids went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Something about him felt wrong. I kept hearing his voice in my head, the way he said my name, the way he watched me. Hours later, I woke to a faint creaking sound. The living room was dark, but moonlight reflected off the snow outside, casting an eerie glow. I peeked out of my sleeping bag and saw him moving through the shadows. He was at the front door, slowly turning the lock. Fear gripped me. He wasn't leaving. He was unlocking the door to let someone in. I nudged my mom, whispering urgently. She woke instantly, her eyes narrowing as she saw him at the door. Quietly, she grabbed the heavy flashlight she'd kept nearby and stood. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. The man froze, his hand still on the lock. He turned slowly, his smile gone. "Just checking the door," he said. "Didn't want it to freeze shut." "It's fine," she said firmly. "Come back to the couch." He hesitated, then nodded and stepped away from the door. My mom didn't move until he was back on the couch. The rest of the night was tense. My mom didn't sleep, and neither did I. The man stayed on the couch, but I could feel the danger radiating from him. At dawn, the blizzard eased. My mom told the man it was safe to leave. He didn't argue. As he put on his coat, he turned to me one last time. "Maybe I'll see you again, Alina," he said, his grin sending a shiver down my spine. After he left, my mom locked the door and called the police. When officers arrived, they confirmed our fears. The man's car hadn't broken down. In fact, there was no car. He had been walking through the storm, targeting isolated homes. They found rope and duct tape in his bag, tools for taking someone. That New Year's Eve, we learned how close we'd come to disaster. The man wasn't just a stranded traveler. He was an intruder, one who had planned to take me or my siblings. And if my mom hadn't been cautious, we might never have seen the new year. December 31st, 2019, the last day of the year. For most people, it was a time of celebration, parties, and resolutions. For me, it was just another day, another reminder of what I had lost. My husband, Michael, had died the year before in a snowstorm. That endless, biting wind had taken him from me, and I had lived alone ever since, in a small house tucked away in a quiet corner of Canada. I always spent winters with my parents in Skagway, Alaska. It was our tradition. They had an old, cozy home surrounded by dense woods, the perfect place to escape the harshness of life. But last night, a snowstorm roared through my area, and I found myself trapped inside. The storm rattled the windows and howled like a wild beast outside. I stayed in my bedroom on the first floor, sipping tea and trying to ignore the loneliness that settled over me like the snow outside. Around midnight, a strange sound pierced through the chaos of the storm, the creak of a door opening. My breath caught in my throat. I was certain I had locked all the doors. I tiptoed to my bedroom door and strained to hear over the wind. The sound didn't repeat, but my imagination ran wild. I stayed awake for hours, my ears tuned to every creak and groan of the house. Morning came, and when I finally ventured downstairs, the front door was locked, just as I'd left it. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing it off as the wind. "You're being paranoid," I muttered. With the storm subsided, I packed my things, eager to leave the house behind for a while. I loaded my car, double-checked the locks, and began the long drive to my parents' home. The journey was uneventful until I arrived in Skagway late that evening. The road to my parents' house ended at the edge of the forest. From there, a narrow, snow-laden path wound between tall, shadowy trees. It was always a peaceful walk. But that night, the air felt different, heavier. As I trudged through the snow, dragging my suitcase behind me, I noticed a figure ahead. A man in a hoodie stood among the trees, watching me. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his posture was tense, deliberate. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond, just stared. There was something eerily familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. After a moment, he turned and walked deeper into the woods, vanishing from sight. I hurried the rest of the way to my parents' house, my mind racing. Who was he? Why did he seem so familiar? For the next few days, I tried to push the memory of the hooded man out of my mind. My parents' house was warm and welcoming, and it felt good to be surrounded by family. But the unease lingered. Then my boss called. "We're facing some unexpected issues," he explained. "I'm sorry, but we need you back. Can you cut your vacation short?" Reluctantly, I packed up and drove back home. It was late evening when I started, and by the time I arrived, it was nearly 2 a.m. The house greeted me with an unsettling stillness, as if it had been waiting. I stepped inside and immediately noticed something strange. A pair of coffee cups sat on the living room table. I distinctly remembered washing and putting them away before I left. My stomach tightened. Was someone here while I was gone? Or had I just forgotten? The thought of being so careless bothered me almost as much as the idea of an intruder. Shaking it off, I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door. Sleep came fitfully, and at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of crying. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I sat up, my heart racing. It was coming from downstairs. As I strained to listen, the sound grew louder, more distinct. A low, mournful sobbing echoed through the house. My blood ran cold as I recognized the voice. It sounded like Michael. I leaped out of bed, barely bothering to grab a flashlight. I rushed downstairs, calling his name, even though I knew it couldn't be him. The living room was empty. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I turned to head back upstairs, but as I reached the bottom step, I froze. Footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there he was, the man from the woods. He stood in the dim light of the living room, his hood pushed back to reveal his face. It was Michael, but it wasn't. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow and unblinking. Frost clung to his hair and eyelashes, and his lips were tinged blue. He stared at me with an expression that was almost sorrowful. But there was something else beneath it, a darkness, an unnatural hunger. I stumbled backward, my knees buckling. The room spun, and I hit the floor hard. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the windows. I was lying on the living room floor, my body aching from the fall. The house was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. I sat up slowly, my mind reeling. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? I scoured the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of anyone else. No wet footprints, no frost, nothing. The coffee cups were still on the table, and everything else was exactly as I had left it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't care about work or the possibility of losing my job. I just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. I called my friend Helena, who lived in a nearby apartment complex. She welcomed me with open arms, no questions asked. As I settled into her spare bedroom that evening, I felt a small measure of relief. The house was behind me, and with it, whatever had haunted me. But even now, as I write this, I can't help but wonder. Was it really Michael? If it was, what did he want? Why? Why did he come back? And most chilling of all, will he come back again? I'm not sure I want to know the answer. Before we get into the next story, if you've come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks,